It's fixed, Ben.
Thank you.
Oh, there we go. Thank you so much. All right. Well, first off, I just want to say thank you for having me today. I'm really excited to talk about snowy plovers and the research that we've been doing here in the San Francisco Bay. I've been working with snowy plovers for close to 10 years now. Did my master's on them, and so I'm really passionate about their conservation. And I'm really excited to be partnering with IBR. It's been really amazing to be able to bring up eggs and chicks and know that you guys can work your magic and help to raise them, and that way we can release them back and give them a chance to thrive. So with that, I want to go ahead and get into the talk. That way we have time to get through it all and do some questions. Just a quick thing here. I've had a little bit of trouble in the past with my PowerPoint with slides not progressing. I have a workaround and I think it should be good, but please let me know when I go to the next slide. Just say something if you don't see it. So. All right, so everybody can see this. Oh, everybody sees the first slide?
Yes.
Okay, and then moving to the next slide, you see, everyone sees that?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right, so just real quick, just an outline. We're just going to go over some general ecology of snowy plovers, different reasons why they've declined, the legal status, and then talk about a lot of our research for the rest of the time. So the bird that we're here to talk about today is the Western snowy plover. Their scientific name is Charadius nivosus nivosus. And I should note specifically the population that we're going to be talking about today is the Pacific Coast population distinct segment. That is the population that is listed. It's sort of a fine distinction, but there's the population that breeds along the Pacific Coast within 50 miles of the coast. And then there's the interior population that's found in the Central Valley a little bit, but largely within alkali lakes of the interior west, like Mono Lake, Great Salt Lake, places in the other locations such as that. So we're going to be talking about the Pacific Coast population. But in any case, so snowy plovers can be differentiated during the breeding season by plumage. Males have a dark neck, crown, and auricular patches. You can see looking at the male on the left, he even has a rusty cap. That's kind of early during the breeding season. They have some of that sort of rusty color. Conversely, females, they'll have some of that same coloration as males, but are going to be overall a little bit lighter in those different areas. And even one thing that we can do to differentiate them is if you have them in the hand, of course, is to measure that forehead bar. And there's a kind of a limit for females in terms of how wide that gets. It's going to be a little bit more narrow than males. However, during the non-breeding season, there isn't really a way to differentiate them. As you can see, most of those markings do fade. And so during the non-breeding season, we can't really tell the difference. Now, the habitat for the Pacific Coast population extends from southern Washington down through almost to the tip of Baja, California, and they're found across that area year-round. There are some subtle differences. Range-wide, most of the habitat that they're going to use is dune-backed sandy beaches, occasionally river bars, and most famously, kind of the Eel River in Humboldt County. They were nesting there for a while, right near the mouth. And also there is some natural salt pan habitat that they use. However, here in the San Francisco Bay, the majority of habitat that they use is going to be salt pan habitat. Some of it is natural. There is some historical salt pan habitat, but a lot of it is provided by former salt production ponds. They also will use dirt and graveled levees that are associated with these ponds, and occasionally dry dredge materials, such as, especially up in the North Bay at places like Montezuma wetlands, not too far from IBR. Now, typically, they lay a 1 to 3 egg clutch, with 3 eggs being the most common. 4 is very uncommon. I think in the past 10 years of monitoring snowy plovers, I've seen 3 4-egg clutches, so pretty rare, but it does happen. One thing that's really important to know about snowy plovers is that they really rely upon crypsis at all stages of life, and that it starts with the eggs. You can see that the coloration of them, this sort of salt and pepper coloration, really blends into the habitats that they choose to nest in. And so the eggs are hard to see, and they specifically are going to select nest sites that are mostly devoid of vegetation, that are open, mostly flat. That way they can see predators. And if a predator approaches, the adult that's incubating the nest is going to run off and hide and hope that they don't find the nest. And so that's something that's really important for them at all life stages. Here's a few more examples of snowy plover nests. They like to use whatever's around, and especially if it is something that's kind of sort of already kind of on the landscape that will kind of help them to blend in, they'll use that. So we have a footprint. In this case, somebody had walked barefoot and trespassed, so I would not recommend that, but we do something called a mud stomp each year to create footprints that they use as scrapes. We also have oyster shells that we've spread to provide habitat, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then one of my favorites here in the bottom right, there is duck hunting allowed during the winter at some of their breeding sites. In this case, we have a duck decoy that broke down, and of course, plovers decided to nest in there. So these are just some of my favorites here. So during the incubation stage, the adults share those duties. It's going to be the female who's incubating during the day, and the male will be typically within about a mile, not too far off, foraging and kind of filling himself up. And then at night, it's going to be the male who's incubating, and it's going to be the female who's going to go off and forage. Something that's really unique about the Pacific Coast population of snowy plovers, because they have such a long breeding season, it goes from March 1st through September 15th, is they have a polyandrous mating system, technically a sequential polyandrous mating system. And what this means is that almost immediately after the chicks hatch, the female is going to abandon. She's going to find another mate and establish a new nest within a few weeks. And it's going to be the male who's going to raise the chicks. And so these pictures you see below, you can tell that it's the male by the dark coloration on his plumage. And so that's something that's somewhat unique. Phalaropes do also, the males raise the chicks, but that's a little different in that situation. So as far as chicks, and some of you have probably seen the chicks that have been brought in, you know that they are precocial, like most shorebird species. Again, cryptic coloration is really important, especially when they first hatch. They got that sort of same coloration as the eggs. It's really important for the first 2 weeks of their life. They really try to blend into their habitat. And their most common way of evading predators is going to be to hunker down and hope that the predators don't see them. And so having that coloration really helps them to do that. At about 2 weeks, their behavior starts to change. That's when I think a lot more of their feathers are starting to grow in. They're faster, they're bigger. They still might hide sometimes. Even adults will kind of hunker down when predators approach sometimes, but they're going to start running more instead of just hunkering down and hiding. And they typically fledge anywhere from 28 to 33 days. 28 is sometimes, but typically it's going to take a few more days for them to really be flight capable. There are, of course, a number of reasons for their decline. Predators are a major issue. This includes raptors like peregrine falcons, and that's something that we've seen more and more as they have recovered. Mammals, especially red foxes. And red foxes are an interesting situation because while they are native to a lot of North America and parts of California, they're not native to the coast. They've been able to eventually make their way to the coast, and because of human development, and have caused a lot of problems for snowy plovers, for least terns, ridgeways, rails, salt marsh harvest mice, you name it. Red foxes have been a big problem, unfortunately. And then, of course, if you're going to talk about conservation, you've always got to mention corvids, common ravens, and crows. I'm sure everyone knows their populations have just been exploding. They're very, very smart animals, and especially the common ravens are a major problem for snowy plovers. They're really smart. Even when I walk out to a nest, I have to make sure that if I'm going to leave tracks, that they don't lead straight to a nest. They take kind of weird routes. They do different things. I want to make sure that they can't kind of identify anything that's going to lead them to the nest. Some other predators, of course, are California gulls, and they are more opportunistic, not necessarily searching for snowy plover eggs or chicks, but will eat them. And they're kind of a unique situation in that before 1981, they didn't breed along the coast. They were just winter residents, and they'd return to the interior. It was in that year, actually, that a land bridge formed to their large colony in Mono Lake. And so their colony was decimated. And it was actually that year that they started breeding in small numbers in the South Bay. SFBBO was monitoring them at that time. I think it was a few hundred birds that were nesting in a pond in Alviso in San Jose. And we've been tracking their population every year. There's now close to 50,000 breeding gulls in the South Bay. So they're a problem for snowy plovers and other shorebirds as well. Disturbance is also a major issue. As I mentioned, snowy plovers, main way of evading predators is by running off and hiding and hoping that they don't see them. When you think about some of their main habitat is sandy beaches, You can see this picture on the left is a good example of how busy beaches can be. And because of that high level of disturbance, snowy plovers have actually abandoned over half of their historical breeding sites along the Pacific coast. So they've been pushed out, unfortunately, because of that. We do have some disturbance in the San Francisco Bay, not quite as much because most of their habitat is in restricted areas. But because of that, our snowy plovers tend to be much more sensitive to disturbance if people do go off trail. And so there can definitely be issues like that depending upon the area. Of course, dogs, unfortunately, are a major issue as well. And even if they don't mean to be predators, that's how plovers are going to view them. And so plovers are going to be spending a lot of energy to get away from them. During the breeding season, it might mean that the male might get separated from the chicks, or the eggs might get trampled. And unfortunately, in some cases, dogs do end up attacking chicks as well. Habitat loss is also a major issue. Invasive plants certainly is one cause, especially on the coast because of Ammophila or European beach grass. It kind of chokes up the environment. And as I mentioned, snowy plovers really rely upon having good visibility of predators. And so if they can't see, they're not going to nest in those areas. And the Ammophila, it actually changes the way that the dunes form so that they become more steep, and it kind of blocks their view. So it has kind of a double effect. So obviously we don't have that here in the bay itself, but what we do have is different types of invasive plants like this slender leaf ice plant. And they will still nest in that, but if it becomes too thick, then it's not going to be a place where they can nest. And so that's kind of the potential issue. Climate change also poses a severe risk. Sea level rise is predicted to be about 1 to 2 meters by the year 2100. This is somewhat comparable to a king tide, like what we're seeing right now around the bay. And this is a picture of the Santa Cruz Beach Boardwalk. I thought it'd be a good example. For those of you that are familiar with this beach, it's normally a pretty wide beach, but during a high tide, during these king tides, there's really not much beach left. And so what you can sort of see is as the sea levels rise, especially places where there's hardscapes and there isn't room for the beach to migrate, snowy plovers are going to get squeezed at a lot of these sites and really not have much beach left to nest at. So because of all these different reasons, snowy plovers have been listed as federally threatened under the Endangered Species Act since 1993. That means that they are protected throughout the year, and it is illegal to harass or cause any form of disturbance or take to them. And so here's a few different examples. We've got a sign that's up out in Pacifica, and then also the East Bay Parks has a sign up at Crown Beach. This is a wintering site for them. They don't breed there just yet. So now just wanted to give you a sense of how big their population is. There's really not that many of them. There has been a kind of a gradual increase in their population. You can see the last published data, unfortunately, is from 2018, and there was about 2,400 adults across the entire Pacific coast. In talking with Fish and Wildlife Service staff, I know that more recent counts that are conducted during this May survey, there was as many as 2,700, but still, that's really not that many across the entire Pacific coast. And I should mention the goal is 3,000 adults for the entire Pacific coast. So we're getting close to that. It's certainly been an improvement, but still certainly work to go. And they'll have to have that number, at least 3,000 for 10 years in order to be considered for delisting. Now, in order to facilitate recovery, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service broke the habitat into 6 different recovery units. We are in Recovery Unit 3, which consists of the 9 counties of the Bay Area within the interior of the Bay. This map is not exactly correct, except for San Francisco. San Francisco is part of Recovery Unit 4. Most of the habitat is, though, found in the South Bay. And when I say that, I mean everywhere south of the San Mateo Bridge. So I'm going to point out just some of the different sites real quick. We've got Hayward Shoreline, which is, of course, is just north of the San Mateo Bridge. Their main breeding site, which is Eden Landing Ecological Reserve. Got various locations of the Don Edwards San Francisco Bay National Wildlife Refuge. And beyond that, there's a few other locations where they also breed. There is also some habitat in the North Bay and the Delta. This includes Naposoma Marsh's wildlife area. And we actually have been doing surveys at one of those sites, the Wingo unit, that's located just a little bit south of the town of Sonoma. They're also found at Hamilton wetlands, and there's been a little bit of breeding activity there this year, and it's kind of starting to increase, and I think monitoring is also starting to increase there as well. And then, as I mentioned, Montezuma wetlands is also a site where they're found. There's a Leastern colony that breeds there, and along with them, some snowy plovers as well. So I just wanted to kind of explain real quick how we go about doing our work. And of course, all starts with conducting our surveys. And what we do is using binoculars and spotting scopes, most often from our vehicles because they kind of function as a blind. We attempt to count all plovers on site, record their location and behavior, and also to identify potential nest locations. And this is what a incubating adult looks like. Of course, this is a female because it's the middle of the day. What you can see though, looking at her, is that she's kind of sitting, she's a little bit puffed up on the ground, her tail is a little bit pushed up. And if we were to watch her for about 5 to 10 minutes, you'd see her stand up, she'd kind of readjust and kind of wiggle back down on the eggs. And when we see something like that, it's a pretty clear sign that she's got eggs. When that's the case, what we do is we go out and we find the eggs and we float them. And doing so allows us to estimate the date of initiation and to project when the eggs are going to hatch. This is really important because sometimes we go to check a nest one week and the next week it's gone. And if we know that the eggs had just been laid and they're gone the next week, we know then that it's impossible for the eggs to have hatched. They had to have been predated or possibly some other cause. So this is important for us to determine fate. It's also really important if we want to do some color banding. And color banding is a tool that we use in order to learn more about snowy plover chick survival, recruitment into the population and migration. And so what we do is we very closely track the hatching progress of the eggs. We'll check on them somewhat frequently. They start to crack, they pip, you can hear peeping, and those kind of different kind of amounts of time based upon those different stages. And we attempt to catch them within 24 hours after they hatch, because the older they get, the tougher they are to catch. Now, each chick is going to get a unique 4-color combo. As you can see, the left leg is going to have a service band, a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the USGS service band. We wrap that in tape as well. That way we have 4 colors. And so that way we can identify them to individuals. I'm going to play this really quick. This is just a video. We were out banding some chicks. Not hearing the sound, unfortunately, but you can see there's an adult who's trying to lure us away. We've got 2 chicks. Third egg was not viable, unfortunately, in this case, but sort of get a sneak peek at their habitat here. We do also sometimes try to catch adults, and we try to trap adults at the nest. When we do, we're going to use something called a snare mat. And what this is basically, as you can see, it's a strip of metal that has a bunch of snares that have been tied onto it. We used to do them around the nest and go and hide. As you can see, that's sort of the positioning of these. It's a square around the nest. What we more often do now is we catch the chicks and the adults are trying to lure us away. We kind of watch where they're running around, and then we'll set them out in those locations. That way we can trap the adult. And this is also really great information because having adults banded allows us to understand their movements, their survival, to understand more about who it is that's nesting. So it can provide a lot of useful data for conservation purposes. And on the right is actually one of my favorite birds. It's, as you can see, it's black over orange and green over yellow. I don't know if anybody has any guesses why this might be my favorite bird. Feel free to shout it out if you think you know. No? All right. So I call this the Bay Area baseball bird. He's a fun bird. So this one was banded as an adult at Pond SF2 in Menlo Park. It's part of the Ravenswood ponds of Don Edwards. And he's known to winter at Ocean Beach and Christie Field in San Francisco. He's been reported there every year, but he returns to the South Bay every year. Most recently, we've seen him nesting at Crittenden Marsh in Mountain View. That's some ponds that are located directly next to Moffett Airfield. And so this is just one of my favorite birds just because of those colors. So one of the things that color banding can tell us is natal site fidelity. And this is a great example, again, at Crittenden Marsh. We had a chick in 2018 that we had banded, black over aqua, aqua over green. He was one of 3 chicks. 2 of them survived. In 2019, he returned to the same area, and he initiated his nest just 100 meters from where his natal nest was. 3 chicks were banded. Unfortunately, those chicks did not survive. In 2020, he again nested over there, and this time 130 meters away from his nest. So very clearly, black aqua, aqua green has a strong site fidelity to this site. I believe he also nested there last year, and I'm not sure if we've observed him there this year yet. Hopefully at some point we will. But this is just an example of what banding can tell us. Now, real quick, I just wanted to share some information about wintering plovers in the SS Bay. And it's important to understand that during the wintertime, we're going to have a mix of our breeding population. Some of them are going to stay here, but some of them are also going to migrate elsewhere in the coast. We're also going to have birds that are going to migrate from elsewhere. So we're going to have birds from Oregon, from Oceano Dunes, from Vandenberg. I think that's about as far south as we've gone. It's kind of northern Santa Barbara County, but it's going to be a mix, and it's also going to be birds from the interior population. So our population typically is going to be a lot higher during the wintertime. And fortunately, you can see that our population has gradually increased during the wintertime, which means that we're providing good habitat for them. But what's more important to look at is our breeding population. And you can see that it's overall our population is much lower. We kind of initially started monitoring snowy plovers in 2003. And at that time, there wasn't a lot of habitat that was being managed for them. Gradually, as that has increased, their population has gone up. And kind of specifically some things that I wanted to point out. I have 2 different lines tracking their population. One is for the entire recovery unit, and the other is for within the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project footprint. And I'm going to talk more about that. But what you can tell is that really the majority of their population is found within that project footprint. They're have committed to supporting 250 birds within that project footprint, but you can see that the goal is to support 500 adults. And so even though this past year we counted the most snowy plovers in our recovery unit that we ever have, which was really great, 288 adults, we're still only a little over halfway to meeting that goal. So we've been working really hard to help them recover both in the Salt Pond Project footprint as well as other sites in the South Bay and in the North Bay as well. All right, so let's take a step back real quick and talk about habitat here in the San Francisco Bay. Now, this is some historical imagery that was done by SFEI. And what I really wanted to just note here is you look at the different types of habitat. You can see that most of what we're looking at is tidal marsh. There's lots of tidal marsh, there's tidal flats. There's a small amount of salt ponds, kind of in the area of Hayward and Union City. That's likely where snowy plovers may have bred before the creation of the salt ponds. There was also fringing sandy beaches and shell bars on the peninsula and in the East Bay. It's possible that they also nested there, but it's likely that there really was a pretty small population of snowy plovers breeding in the San Francisco Bay. Here's a little bit more historical imagery to kind of show you what it looked like. And this is present day what that became. And so what you can see is that tidal marsh, kind of beginning in the mid 1800s, was converted to salt production ponds. And while it was a major loss for tidal marsh species, it ended up creating habitat for snowy plovers at the same time that they were losing habitat along the beach. And so it was kind of helpful for them because it provided an alternative habitat for them to go and breed in. Eventually, what happened with these salt production ponds is, different companies own them. Eventually, pretty much all of them came to be owned by Cargill. They still do own some of them, but they came to realize that they really didn't need all of this habitat or all of these ponds in order to create the amount of salt that they wanted. And so in 2003, they actually sold the bulk of these salt ponds back to both U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And with that, the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project was created. And I'll share with you a little bit about this project real quick. The goal of this project is to restore 15,000 acres of salt pond habitat. It's actually the largest tidal marsh restoration project on the West Coast and the second largest in the country behind the Everglades. So it's a really, really big project going on. The goal basically is to open these ponds up to tidal action, Eventually that will allow vegetation to grow and restore it back to marsh, and it's been successful at that. Some areas are already supporting rails and mice. We're only 19 years into the project, and it's projected to be at least a 50-year project, and so there's a lot more work to do. Now, the reason I bring this all up is because it's important to understand the impacts of tidal marsh restoration. What it is going to do is it's going to increase tidal marsh habitat, obviously. This is great for rails. It's great for salt marsh harvest mice. It's going to improve environmental health because, as I'm sure many of you know, tidal marshes can clean the bay, and kind of soak up water. It can create resiliency to climate change by kind of soaking up water and kind of stopping wave action. And of course, it's also increasing public access by extending and connecting the bay trail, as well as adding new locations of the bay water trail. So these are all really great things, right? Unfortunately, what it will also do is it will decrease the dry pond breeding habitat that snowy plovers and California leaf terns have come to rely upon. Other species such as blackneck stilts, American avocet, also have pretty large populations here in the South Bay that they depend upon as well. And it's also, of course, important to know that the San Francisco Bay is one of, if not the most important stopover sites on the Pacific Flyway, and hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of migratory shorebirds and waterfowls use the San Francisco Bay, and specifically the salt ponds, at various times to roost, potentially to forage as well. And so this could cause potential problems for all of these different species, right? So one of the ways that we have worked with the Salt Pond Project to try to address this issue for snowy plovers was by conducting some oyster shell enhancement. And we had started with some pilot plots that showed that snowy plovers preferred to nest in these locations, that they had higher nest success in these areas. And so with that knowledge in hand, we spread over 20 hectares of oyster shells at this pond in Eden Landing. Now, the goal was to create this really large, high density nesting area that would create some really good camouflage and cover. You can see here from the picture, this is a female that's sitting on some eggs. You send this back. They can be really hard to spot within here. It's a huge area, and they're right about the same size. These oyster shells they came from Drake's Bay oyster farm before it closed down. And the oysters that they grew there were really, really large. And so they're actually almost the same size as the snowy plovers. And so they blend in really well into the habitat. And just to kind of quickly show, as you can see from this map, these are nest locations over the years. 2015 was the first year that we spread them. You can see that they were very much attracted to these oyster shell plots. So I'm going to kind of quickly go through some of our findings on hatch success, our nesting success based upon this data. So 2014 was the year before the enhancement. This is pond E14. We had 54 nests. The main thing that I want to point out is that they had a really low hatching success. We want to see at least half of the nests hatch, and during that year, we only saw 33% hatch. So the first year of the enhancement, the amount of nests nearly doubled to 98, and our hatch rate went up all the way to 60%, which was great. Unfortunately, the next year, we still had a lot of nests, but our depredations went way up. Our hatch rate was 23%. It was even worse than 2014. The reason for this was because of predators. In 2015, we had some peregrine falcons nesting nearby. They took a few chicks out of this nest, but overall, 2015 was a good year, as I want to remind you. But it was really 2016 where the ravens really started to exert themselves. And as I mentioned, there was 88 nests on the pond. 60 of those were depredated. We recorded 30 of those depredation events. All 30 of them were common ravens. So common ravens, very, very smart. This is just a few. This is literally just a family of ravens because they're territorial. They defend their territory. There may be some individuals that come through, but by and large, this, we believe, was all done by just a few ravens. So it was really frustrating to watch this. We're starting to become a little depressed by this point because we feel like we've maybe attracted plovers to a place that's gonna, kind of end up with having, really bad breeding success. However, in 2017, things turned around a little bit, pun slightly intended, because leaf terns started to breed at the pond. The reason why this is potentially good is because unlike snowy plovers who are passive in defending their colony, snowy plover or California least terns and other tern species are aggressive in defending against predators. And so we were excited when this happened. We're thinking maybe they're going to be BFFs. All right, maybe not quite, but overall, snowy plovers and least terns do get along. They commonly breed together in many locations, as I mentioned in Montezuma, here at Eden Landing, a little bit at Hayward Shoreline, and certainly some locations in Southern California as well. The least terns that year were really, really successful. We only had like 20 nests, but most of them hatched. We produced a lot of fledglings, and we met some of the goals for least terns, which is great because they're an endangered species. And this is important because what we saw is a dramatic effect of the least tern's presence on snowy plovers. So before the least terns arrived, it was another terrible year for snowy plovers. Only 26% of the nests were hatching. After they showed up, hatching went way up to 70%. And what really kind of stands out is you can sort of see looking at this box, it really becomes clear that snowy plovers were selecting nest sites close to the least tern colony. They recognize that it benefits them. And you look at this data, you can see that the closer the snowy plover nest was to the colony, the higher the hatch rate was. So this is really exciting. We've got two listed species breeding here now. We're expecting now that everything's going to be great from now on. They're both going to do well. As you can see, the hatch rate went way up in 2017. Unfortunately, the years since for least terns have not been kind to them. We've had a lot of nesting on site, but very, very few fledglings. Just a few each year, in some cases, none at all. And as you might expect, this has also impacted snowy plovers as well. We've still had a lot of nests there, but you can see in none of those years have we reached 50% of nests hatching. And last year was by far the worst, the least amount of nests we've monitored at this site since, I want to say 2012, and the worst hatching success as well. That's just, yeah, that's really tough to see. Another sort of data point for you guys to look at. This is some data from our color banding and kind of looking at our fledging success. You can see that early on, you follow this black line, snowy plover chicks were very successful at E14. Gradually, though, that has gone down as predators have realized that there is this high density population of snowy plovers that they're an easy meal for them. And this is kind of what this really shows is that snowy plovers, they're a semi-colonial species. They like to nest sort of near each other, but when we have too high of density, it becomes a problem because predators really pick up on them. You can see though, gradually over time now, E14 has lower fledging success than the rest of Eden Landing and the rest of the recovery unit as a whole. Of course, the reason for this, as I mentioned, is predators. In some years, like in 2018, we identified red foxes as a major issue, and they continue to be one. 2019, we had some evidence of California gulls impacting both snowy plovers and least terns. We also had a few other species. Probably most notable is our least tern chicks and eggs started to disappear, and we weren't really sure why, but we had these tracks that were leading to all of the nests, and we were really confused because it looked like a snake, right? It looked like a snake was going to all the different nests. We started talking to different wildlife trackers, to different people who we were going to start setting stuff up to catch a snake. We ended up talking with some predator control folks, and they said, this is probably a skunk with a muddy tail. And I set out a camera trap, and as you can see in this picture on the top right, it was in fact a skunk with an extremely muddy tail, so muddy that it couldn't lift its tail, and it was just dragging it across the pond. It had gotten wet in the marsh and then picked up mud. And so I kind of learned after that not to underestimate skunks. I probably did before that, but they can be voracious predators of eggs and chicks. Northern harriers are certainly also a species that has caused a lot of issues for snowy plovers, and especially because we're restoring a lot of tidal marsh directly next to this habitat. Northern harriers breed in tidal marsh, and so this is kind of gradually increasing their population. And when there's not a lot of voles or mice to eat, they're going to look at snowy plover eggs and chicks. There's also other species like white-tailed kites, American kestrels that also can be predators of chicks. 2020, coyotes showed up for the first time. We had common ravens, northern harriers, all became issues for snowy plovers. 2021, it continued, ravens, peregrines, you name it, kind of the full gamut of all these different predators. So we're going to switch gears again. I talked to you about Eden Landing. I'm just going to wrap up here and talk to you about Ravenswood real quick and just kind of tell another story. Some of you kind of are already familiar with this, but Ravenswood is really one of the most important breeding sites outside of Eden Landing. There's a lot of nesting that goes on there. Now this is located in Menlo Park, right near the base of the Dumbarton Bridge, and specifically actually across from Facebook's headquarters. You can see looking at this map that they nest kind of all throughout these ponds. And of course, I have to throw in a picture of the cute snowy plovers when I can. But the reason why I'm bringing this up today is because last year we were able to rescue an abandoned nest. We had 2 different nests that had been abandoned. Unfortunately, one of them did not survive because the eggs were dead by the time we realized it was abandoned. But the other one, when I came to collect those eggs, I realized, surprisingly, I'm pretty sure this nest had been abandoned for over a week. But we do have, of course, pretty warm temps during the summer. These eggs had survived for about a week without being incubated and had started the process of hatching and were still kind of barely alive. And so we were able to take those eggs in. We transferred them to Ohlone Wildlife Rehab across the bay. And then from there, they were brought up to IBR. And so this was really the beginning of what's formed into a great partnership. You guys did amazing work and were able to hatch all 3 eggs. Able to raise them, and then we released them afterwards at Eden Landing Ecological Reserve. Now, unfortunately, I think only one of those has been resighted, but I think it's been seen this year. So that's really, really great because if they're able to survive their first winter, then I think that bodes pretty well for them to be around for at least a few years. I think the average time of survival for snowy plovers in the wild is about 3 to 5 years. And so if at least one of those survives, then we've done a good job. So with that, I just want to acknowledge all of our field staff that made this work possible, all of our partners at our various locations where we monitor, and of course, all of our funders. It really takes a village to get all of this work done. So thank you to everyone. Thank you to IBR. Really, really appreciate it. So with that, that's the end of my talk, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Ben. That was a great presentation. Very informative.
It was fabulous.
I have a question. You hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, Roberto from, I guess, Vagabond. Anyway, thank you. It's very informative. I really appreciate your presentation because I have a heavy interest on snowy plovers. Somehow they caught my attention, you know, and I love seeing a lot of artwork about them too. Anyway, the question I have for you, how much are humans having an impact on causing this imbalance between snowy plovers and the predators that you highlighted? You know, and I'm asking that question because is there a way for legally to get people to respect those breeding areas for snowy plovers and to, you know, have like a moratorium or a quarantine when people don't disturb them and let nature take its course rather than humans creating salt ponds or whatever and causing the decline of snowy plovers? Again, I appreciate the other species too, and a lot of them that you cited are very important to our ecology, you know, especially in California. So, you know,
Roberto, this is JD. Let's give Ben a chance to answer the question. We also have some other folks ready to go. So
I hear you, sir, and I was just about to stop. Yes, sir.
Thanks so much. Go ahead, Ben.
No big deal. Sorry.
Okay. There's a lot in there, so it's a little tough to unpack, but I'll just start with, I think your first question was about human disturbance. On beaches, there are areas that are roped off to provide nesting areas for snowy plovers. And then here in the San Francisco Bay, their habitat is close. People are not allowed to walk on salt ponds, areas that in former salt production ponds, I should say, they're managed for wildlife now. So they are close to the public, but of course there are still issues with vandalism and especially in Southern California, where there's a lot more people are right up against the habitat. But yeah, it certainly is a complex issue. A lot of the predator species really do thrive because they're around humans. Ravens, red foxes, raccoons, they're really adept at living with people. So it's sort of a struggle to ensure that those species aren't having impacts on wildlife, including snowy plovers. I also wanted to quickly mention plover, plover. We're kind of split in the conservation world and in the plover world. We are plover people at SFBBO. Some people are plover people. We won't hold it against you. Just throwing that out there.
Great, thank you so much, Bim. Star, you have a question. You have to unmute though, Star. Here, I clicked you to unmute.
How's that?
Yeah, good.
The situation where you had the family of ravens, have there been any consideration to trapping that family?
Yeah, so one important thing to understand about the work that's done, and I know this is going to make some folks uncomfortable, is that there is predator control. It's not something that we conduct, but it is conducted by the USDA, Wildlife Services, and they are lethally removed. And so that is a component of conservation, and that really is kind of a core component of really protecting a lot of threatened and endangered species. And so they were removed, and as soon as you do that, it buys some time, but eventually some more ravens move in.
Something else. Oh boy. Thank you.
Anybody else have a question? There was something in the chat. Oh, Carol, you have a question?
Yeah. What do the 4 bands represent? Do each one mean something else?
They're unique. It's a unique combination. And so the left leg combination, like for instance, you had black over orange. We have, I want to say 8 or 9 different left leg combinations. And then we have different variations on that right leg to give us a bunch of different band combinations. But that just is a unique identifier for that specific bird. It's going to have a service band with a serial number, and then associated with that is going to have that 4-color combination. That way we can track each individual.
Great. Rachel, do you want to unmute and clarify your question? Put in chat.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Rachel. I'm a master's student looking at interested in bird behavior and ecology and stuff. So I was just wondering if there were any like university researchers or stuff that you guys partner with, or that work kind of in that area on these sorts of problems. I'm always looking for people because application season's coming this fall.
Sure. Yeah. So kind of locally, I did my master's at San Jose State, and that's kind of where I did that work. We are currently working with Berkeley on a predator study at Eden Landing, and that's with I think 50 cameras that we set up across the reserve. It's a camera array that will give us information on kind of predator movements through the reserve, as well as actually a trespass. And then historically, there was a professor up at Humboldt State that did a lot of snowy plover research, and a ton of different students did work there, and they've kind of spread across and are doing work. So yeah, that professor retired, unfortunately. It was Mark Caldwell, but yeah, that's sort of as far as I know, sort of the researchers that had done any sort of snowy plover related stuff.
Cool. Thanks for your guys' awesome work.
Thank you.
Carol? Unmute. You have to unmute.
How many years are there between surveys?
Yes. So we are out every single day. For 6 months out of the year, I'm literally surveying a different site. It keeps us incredibly busy because we really do, SFBBO, we do basically all of the snowy plover monitoring in the South Bay. East Bay Regional Parks District monitors at one of their locations within Hayward Shoreline, where they have their Leastern colony. But we actually do the monitoring at the rest of the Hayward Shoreline, all of Don Edwards, all of Eden Landing, and then I send folks up to the North Bay, a little bit to Monterey Bay. And so, yeah, I was out in the field today for 10 hours, banded 8 chicks, found a nest, did all sorts of stuff today. So yeah, we do a lot of surveys. The breeding window survey happens every year in May, middle of May, and then the wintering window survey that everyone across the entire coast is doing that happens in the middle of January.
Thank you.
Anybody else? I don't see anything
Well,
new.
yeah, actually,
Carol?
I have another one. You said the ravens, the predators were removed. Were they relocated or are they euthanized?
They're euthanized.
And Betsy has a question?
Do you think that people feeding wildlife like skunks, raccoons, the animals that live around people so easily, do you think that impacts the plovers and the terns?
Yeah. I think that's going to be more of an impact of people leaving trash. That's especially an issue for attracting different types of corvids. Maybe you've even heard of with marbled mirrolets when you're in the forest, it'll attract, Steller's jays and things like that. It's certainly an issue. All of these different species are really, really adept at living off of us. That's why there's so many raccoons and skunks and crows and ravens, because they're good at kind of living off of our trash. And so whether or not we're purposefully feeding them or not, that's why their populations are so large. Same thing with gulls, actually. Those California gulls, their populations exploded because they go to landfills and just live off of the trash. And so that's a major issue that we try to address where we can, but it's kind of tough to stop them in the end.
Was that unusual to see a skunk in that area, or do you see them?
So it's not unusual. It's unusual in the respect that we don't typically actually see them. Early in the morning we might catch them, but they're kind of more crepuscular. I'm going to be foraging early morning, kind of at dusk and dawn, kind of in the night. But yeah, they are around, and even with trapping and removal, it sort of just buys a little bit of time. There's pretty much an endless supply of all of these different predator species in a large urban environment like this.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
JD, you have a question?
Yeah, well, just a quick bird rescue version answer to Betsy's question. Absolutely, yes, we are concerned whenever wildlife is tampered with by people, whether it's specific to snowy plover impacts, it will definitely impact the animal that's being fed. I just wanted to sort of say that I have donated directly to SFBBO and got an incredible privilege of getting to see all the work that Ben was just describing. Those of you who are excited by what you just saw, you're not alone. It's amazing work. Just a kind of a plug to keep an eye out for volunteer opportunities, donation opportunities. They're a really exceptional group, and I really am excited about this partnership. And Ben actually informed me in the chat that we received 3 new rescued babies just today or yesterday. So we're up for another round after having released some just I think about a week ago. That's all I had.
Thanks. And I actually got to fill in for JD and do the mud stomp. So that was really fun. It's a pretty cool thing to do.
That's right.
That was great. Julie, you have a question?
Oh yeah. Hi Ben. Thanks. That was a wonderful presentation. I was just curious. Well, the way I was going to ask I'm sure you already thought of this ahead of time, but so I'm looking at the picture of the plover in your background and how well they are camouflaged in. So with the bands, I guess the bright colors it doesn't make them more easily spotted.
No. So you got to remember that these chicks are tiny. They're going to fit in the palm of your hand, and even as adults, they're still one of the smaller shorebirds. So yeah, it's pretty negligible in terms of impact, in terms of that.
Anybody else have a question for Ben?
I see there's some messages in the chat, and one from Rachel about decoy eggs, and that certainly is something that's been studied. Filling eggs with carbachol. It's a chemical that makes ravens kind of basically just violently sick and really not want to eat the eggs. There's research that was done with that in Camp Pendleton. Unfortunately, what ends up happening is even if they eat those eggs, eventually they they do find some eggs that are the reward and not the punishment. And it's just never been enough to cause them to avoid that. And more so, it's just from a dollars perspective, it's just the amount of resources that it takes to actually do that. It makes it tough to employ in a consistent basis.
Anybody else? Otherwise, we're going to say thank you so much for Ben and let him go on from his very long day. And thank you. This was really fun. I think everybody will get a lot out of this. And we sure appreciate your time in doing this and all the work that you do.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me today. It was great to share my research, and I look forward to continuing the partnership with everyone.
Thanks so much, Ben.
Thanks.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ben.
Thank you.
That
Thank
was
you.
phenomenal.
You're welcome to stay